and welcome to another roundup of blockchain gaming news from blockchaingaming.biz. Today is Friday, 14th of March. I'm your host, Jenny Jordan. With me is John Jordan as ever. Hi, John. How are you?
Good.
Good. Apptokens are still inevitable. Are they more than ever? Good. Good. Right. So in my mind, I thought there hadn't been that much news actually this week, but looking at it now, we've got quite a few things to go through. So we're going to start off with Wildcard, because I would say that's one of the most significant games probably in the industry at the moment. And there's been some, would you say, surprising news this week in terms of what they revealed about their token, their bigger ecosystem, their thousands platform. I'll let you dive into it and unfold sort of where this is going.
Yeah, cool. So, yeah, as you say, Wildcard has been one of those games that, for various reasons, has been, I think it goes under the title sort of most anticipated. Partly, it's the pedigree of the developer. So they're the guys, actually Paul Bettner is the sort of CEO. He runs the company with his wife, Katie. But he's worked on massive games in the past. So Age of Empires, a massive strategy game out of Microsoft, or what became Microsoft. So he worked on tons of those games. That was his start of his career as a programmer. Then he set up his own company with his brother, I think, and they did Words with Friends, massive game, eventually for Zynga. So the start of free-to-play mobile and very social mobile game where you're playing, like basically Scrabble with your friends, not quite Scrabble, but that sort of thing. He got early into VR games, so he did some VR stuff. Obviously, VR never got really big, but for a lot of he worked on some really billion-dollar sort of traditional hardcore sort of PC games. Then he got into mobile early, got into VR early. VR wasn't as big because VR wasn't as big, and now it was sort of quite interesting that he was someone who got into blockchain, and he's not someone who sort of clearly needs the money. He's very well off from his successes in the games business, and also he was someone who has not sort of he's spoken about. He's not really spoken about crypto at all, and he's very much, maybe there's some other people we'll talk about later on in the podcast, but very much someone who's sort of clearly interested in what the technology can do, but is not interested sort of in the technology for itself. Like some people in crypto and blockchain are, into crypto and blockchain almost because they love crypto and blockchain, and not so much how come this fix problems in the world, just to sort of, in a way, sort of make money, but it's sort of you get very narrow, sort of a narrow focus for a lot of people, and certainly in the gaming space. But he just comes at it from a very different perspective. You can see that on his Twitter and stuff. So we had this game, and we've seen over the sort of last couple of years quite a lot of gameplay, and they've had tournaments with sort of KOLs and stuff, and it's sort of like a really polished, really nice game, sort of a MOBA sort of element to it. So it started off as a 1v1 where you had both players have a base, and then they're sort of spawning attackers to go and attack the other people's base, and that sort of morphed a little bit over time how that exactly happened, but it really looks really nice. And he did these tokens called wild passes, but it wasn't very clear what they were sort of for. Obviously people were thinking it's like early access type things, but it wasn't very clear, like if the characters in the game were going to be NFTs, or they were a blockchain game, but you didn't know how blockchain was going to be in there. There wasn't a white paper. They also raised quite a lot of money, $46 million, because obviously why wouldn't you back this guy who's made billions of dollars in the past? So there was sort of, we knew what the game sort of was, but there was sort of bits that weren't connected really, that we couldn't really understand where the blockchain was. And then I think it was sort of late last year actually, they started talking about this thing called Thousands. And because they were very focused, they'd always said they were very focused on esports. The esports platform is Twitch, owned by Amazon. Actually doesn't make any money, but that's sort of where everyone streams. That's the sort of the streaming platform. So the way they were talking about it was they were going to try and integrate Twitch into their game Wildcard, and they couldn't get it to work. So they ended up building their own version of Twitch. So actually the blockchain bit isn't the game. Wildcard, as they announced this week, is going to be a Web 2 PC console game. The advantage is that is obviously there's no, people aren't signing up for wallets and stuff to play the game. They can distribute it through Steam. They can go on sort of consoles. It's a beautiful game. Not that I played it, but I've watched a lot of videos and stuff of it. It just looks really nice. But the crypto bit is this Thousands platform, and that's the streaming bit. So that's you can play the game and never get involved in even the streaming bit. And even you can do the streaming bit. I don't know if you can do the streaming bit and not get involved in crypto. I'm not quite sure about that bit, but the crypto is all based around this Thousands platform, and that is sort of leveraging some ideas that people have had for a long time about streaming and getting people who are watching computer games more into the action. So there's obviously things you can do. You can sort of do sort of cosmetic things that people sort of voting for different sort of things in the game, or you're not directly impacting gameplay because that would be weird. But there's sort of stuff you can do in there. And the other thing they announced this week was this WC token, so the Wild Coin token, which I hadn't really mentioned at all, and it wasn't very clear how a token would fit into this whole ecosystem. And now they've said some things, not everything. The token is actually live, so people have been airdropped this token. It doesn't have a price because they've basically locked it into wallets. So I don't know technically how you do that, but obviously it's something that we've mentioned in the past with Apptokens, and other people have done sort of similar things. So clearly you can write it into the smart contract that it can't be traded. And obviously we have soul-bound NFTs. They're a similar sort of non-tradable token. So this token is sort of live in terms of people have it in their wallets, but it's not live on exchanges and can't be traded as far as I know at the moment. There's no price for it I can see. And what they've said in the white paper that has now come out, a sort of a limited white paper, is you'll be able to use that token to, you're obviously able to stake it and get some governance. So that's pretty standard. I wouldn't say it's really worked very well for games, but there's like Star Atlas and Sandbox and other projects have DAOs that are voting on things. Blocklaws as well has a voting system. It's very limited, but you can see over time people might want to vote vote certain on certain sort of things. But the other interesting thing is prediction markets. So we've talked a bit about prediction markets recently with the forecast prediction market, which is predicting sort of news and the price of tokens and stuff. This is obviously a prediction market based on what's happening in the esports, in the esports bit of Wildcard. So the prediction market, they call it prediction market rather than betting, but it's sort of like a legal not fig leaf, but there's a legal difference between the two. But obviously, if people are playing in Wildcard, it's like which players are going to win, or the things you can sort of wager on in that. So actually, the token is they're locking it down in terms of speculation on price, but in terms of how it's used for, one of the use cases will be in some ways highly speculative because you'll be sort of betting on what teams are going to win. And then they've also said there's going to be these what are called Wildorgs, so wild organisations. They're like franchises within the game. I'm not quite clear in my head how that's going to work, but if you want to come in and buy a franchise, so obviously sort of buying a team. So I guess there'll be individual players playing the game, but there'll also be teams playing the games as well. So you'd need a lot of wild card token in order to sort of set up a team. That would be like coming in and spending, probably, I don't know, necessarily millions of dollars, but, that'd be for something like guilds, I suppose, would want to set up a guild. And then so you'd have, I guess, an esports tournament for individuals that we could maybe enter if we were good. And then you'd have an esports tournament for teams. And that would be, obviously, there's, a whole ecosystem, Team Liquid and FaZe and all these people who do, just gaming esports, and they set up teams, and some of them are very successful, so they have that as well. So it's starting to put the pieces together in a nice way, which I think separates the blockchain, uses the blockchain for the thing that sort of blockchain's good for, and doesn't, and they're very clear even with the game that there's no pay to win in the game. So there is in-app purchases in Wildcard, the Web 2 game, but they're only for the specific, they're for cosmetics and skins and the things that people, in the non-blockchain gaming sector spend billions and billions of dollars on every year. So it's quite an elegant way of doing it. And I think it definitely, makes Wildcard, even if it wasn't there already, it's definitely like, a top 10, top 5 sort of game now in terms of, is this one of the games that's going to sort of bring millions of people at least into a sort of blockchain sort of ecosystem, whether they're using blockchain or not, different question.
No, I think it's very cleverly worked out, and that how now they can go on all of the Web 2 kind of distribution channels and platforms as a Web 2 game, but equally have that Web 3 element. Just to clarify what you said about the token, it's not tradable at the moment, and it won't be until the game officially launches later in 2025, if even then. They have just said that they're using the token now to build a community and to build holders that can that will remain with the community and build sustainability that way. But it won't be traded for a long time.
And they did then airdrop to the people who had been involved in the past, held NFTs, certain events they'd done in the past. So they did an airdrop to that, and then they also had a sort of test event on when was it Wednesday, which I think went really well, and people interacting in that test event also they were getting airdropped tokens. So the point of the token, maybe spend a bit of time on this, is, as you say, it is the token. None of it's going to the developer, none of it's going to the investors, which is interesting. And they made this sort of point that they are fully committed to making the game very successful as a Web 2 game. So they see their return, and the return of the investors will be people spending tens of millions of dollars a year in-app purchases, buying skins, the usual sort of stuff. And they say that's a big enough win for us. We don't also need part of the token. And having been involved in sort of investments in blockchain games, that's always been a sort of tricky thing for investors to get their head around. If I'm buying equity in a company and there's this token, where does the value flow if the game's successful? Does it go to the equity? Does it go to the token? And over time, people have really changed their minds on where they sort of want to go on that. But it is interesting that clearly they've said to the investors, we're doing a token. We're not going to get any of it. You're not going to get any of it. This is going to the community. Obviously, if you want to buy it on the open market at some point, you can do that. But our focus is to grow the equity of value of the company. And clearly, a lot of startups are not going to be able to do that. One, because they're not going to be able to raise the sort of $50 million you need to make this sort of game. And two, because they can't have the grown-up arguments with investors to say, this is how we're doing it. If you don't want to do it, you're not investing in us. So obviously, you have to be a figure with a certain level of prestige and reputation in order to get those investors in. And they had a very high level of, sort of high institutional grade investors in their game. So that's sort of interesting. The other thing is that for the token, I mean, it's interesting that people always find a way around things. So at the moment, the token's not tradable, but obviously people, if they wanted to, could probably sell their accounts. So if you had some tokens, you could basically clear everything out of that account and sell your wallet to someone. So there's always ways and means around that. So it's sort of interesting from that point of view, But I think going back to sort of what we mentioned before, more and more I now see sort of people using Apptoken type sort of strategies, and the Apptoken is a particular protocol that gives you these sort of options in a standardized form that you can choose what you want to do. But having tokens that are locked, as much as you can lock them into a wallet and not be tradable on exchanges, is a clear part of something that Gabe Leiden from Apptoken has sort of thinks is the biggest problem for the blockchain games industry. Is as soon as you have a token, it gets speculated away, or 99% of the tokens are held in wallets and never used in the game. And actually, the other thing is Wildcard's way of having a Web 2 game and a Web 3 ecosystem around that is quite a clever way of splitting those two things up. So you sort of, the token can be speculative at some point in the future, but equally it's being used in a speculative way. So that sort of makes sense that the speculative token would be used in a speculative way rather than in a utility way. And often that's the problem where people go, this is a utility token, but it's quite hard to make something a utility token if it's in just free floating crypto markets. So the more I think about what they've done, Wildcard, the sort of the cleverer it sort of becomes in terms of doing the thing, using the technology in the place where you want it and not where it's going to blow up your sort of
no,
game.
exactly. Yeah. And they're trying to, they'll drive players by having a good game. They won't drive players by giving them tokens, because you will earn tokens by turning up to thousands and watching the games. You'll be eligible just for turning up, and then sort of based on your engagement and activities as a spectator just as much as playing. So that's another sort of nice feature of it. Anyway, are we done with that? Yeah, good. Let's move on. Talk about Axie's new MMO, Atia's Legacy. That was, I think, that was unveiled last week, wasn't it? So we talked sort of the main chunk of the discussion then, when we sort of introduced what it was and where it's going in 2025. And already, I think, what day was it last week? Anyway, it's been about 7, 8, maybe 9 days or so now that the pre-registrations have been open. And it's come to 2.5 million. Last time we wrote about it 3 days ago. It's probably higher now. Actually, when we wrote this article, it was 1.5 million, but then we got corrected by Sky Mavis Jeff Serlin saying, "Oh, that's too late. Now it's 2.5 million." So who knows what it's up to.
Yeah.
But that's not bad. It's clearly a lot of us going on around that. You would expect that, when you, from sort of Sky Mavis, developer that it is, the reputation it's got, Axie Infinity, obviously, the early sort of success in Web3, and now this continuation kind of that game. So, yeah, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, well, no, as you say, it is, you know, going back to sort of most anticipated games. I mean, clearly, just with the track record of Sky Mavis and the history they've had, and you know, loads of people are still playing Axie Infinity. Not as many as sort of were at the peak time, but it's whatever it is, 110,000 daily active wallets. So people have, you know, I can't remember what the number is. There's I can't, you know, millions of people holding those assets. So, you know, and this game looks like, I mean, it's difficult. They started work on it a year ago, and as we sort of said with Wildcard, you know, these sort of games actually take many years. So sort of the problem might be that they sort of rush it a little bit. But clearly there is pent up demand for Sky Mavis to do another proper Axie game, and they're sort of the attempt to do sort of little games and spin off games and mobile games from other developers hasn't really, you know, none of those have really worked. So demand is for a sort of bigger game, but yeah, that'd be my only concern is they're going to end up, there's going to be sort of too much sort of demand for it, and it comes out and it's sort of not quite as polished as it needs to be. But that's a argument for another time, another year perhaps. But yeah, people are really keen.
In regards to the economy, there were a few details coming out this week from what is it, COO Alexander Larsen. Can you talk?
Yeah, I mean they were very broad brush sort of approaches of how, you know, if you were designing what is effectively a sort of a, you know, massive multiplayer online game with a persistent economy, you know, I mean, it didn't delve into details, but it's sort of like, you know, thinking about things like scarcity. So clearly this game is building on, to some degree, on the Axie Infinity Homeland resource game that they messed around with for a couple of years and never quite gelled together. But that had a lot of resources. I mean, really a lot of resources. They probably went a bit over the top on it because you had a whole bunch of resources and then you had the rarity of resources. So it did get quite complicated. But the whole point of this one is that, you know, you have rarity of resources. So people have to either fight or trade to get the resources they need. You have sort of complex crafting mechanics, which obviously these games tend to have anyway. So that if you want to create this sort of high level gear, so the main gameplay in Attica, is it Atia's legacy is sort of building a squad of 4 Axies and gearing them, leveling them up and gearing them up. So you want to have really cool gear on them. You have to get the right recipes and the right resources and build it and all that sort of stuff. So on an individual player basis, you want to have sort of, you know, the stuff you're going out and getting via combat, I guess PVE, so fighting in the environment to get these resources. Then you might be using them or you might be selling them on to other people, and you sort of create that sort of economy. And then you at a higher level, they're having like guild wars. So that's obviously players coming to get many players coming together to create a bigger group. And then it looks like that's where the PvP bit comes in. So that's when you're fighting other guilds over, you know, much bigger sort of prizes. So yeah, it's I think, you know, that sort of game design stuff has obviously been developing over the last sort of 30 years. so it's that high level is sort of nothing new. I guess the obviously the interesting thing is with blockchain, these things have real value, and probably again I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but they did say they were going to sort of experiment with NFTs and resources and stuff, and that, to me, that again seems like an obvious place where you would use something like Apptoken. You don't have to use the Apptoken protocol, but not having all these items being highly speculative in value, even if they are blockchain items, sort of having to start off with at least have sort of fixed exchange rates or exchange rates that don't change very much. sort of have sort of control over that part of the economy until it's sort of built up. And similar games, Block Lord is another one that I play a lot, and that doesn't have that many resources, but you can sort of see it taking a lot of time to sort of work out how you would trade between these different resources and gold and higher level ones. And that does take time. And so with these games, you sort of, like even with Acti, this Atia Legacy, they want to get a playable version sort of out, very early version out sort of this summer, and do testing towards the end of next year. But even when the game is sort of into open beta, whenever that would be, 2026, I suppose, you would still be sort of quite careful about how you would run those economies, and potentially you might have to sort of wipe it all and reset it, because they're just very complex, even without blockchain.
You would say though, wouldn't you, that kind of it certainly feels like the industry is going through quite a lot of maturation, like almost like a growth spurt, but not a growth spurt as in expansion in size, but very much growing in maturity when it comes to tokens and kind of tokenomics, how they've learned from mistakes. There's been sort of almost 7 years now of failed experiments, and because of that, some studios have really taken heart and learned a lot of hard lessons, and now we see the reworking of it. Sort of, you can take Pixels as well as an example, but just looking at how Wildcard has been presenting their kind of their new model. We're going to get on to talk about CCP Games, which is obviously also they've got NFTs and the token and that in their ecosystem. We've been mentioning Soccerverse and how they've. We actually have a really good interview this week out with Soccerverse on our website, explaining a lot more about their economy and how they have this completely different model to what's been sort of tested before in Web3, which brings back sort of to a Web2 game that's been existing for decades, long before Web3. So there is a lot of change going on at the moment, a lot of maturation sort of, and I think we'll see that sort of transformation of I think Web3 starting to work, starting to come together. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I would maybe not go quite that far. I think what you're seeing is the bits of Web3 that don't work have just been tried over and over again so many times that as people just keep trying the obvious things,
copying each other.
That obviously doesn't work. And I think for the the games that have lasted now for a number of years, and you can argue sort of how sort of good they are, but they've sort of lasted enough to somehow keep going. They've probably gone through several cycles of speculative people coming into those games and trying to make money, and then obviously maybe making money for some time and then losing money, and then sort of trying again, and it gets to a point where people just go, I'm not going to sort of touch that game anymore. And that's sort of in a sense really what you want, because then no matter how, or as long as you have a big enough player base who are just playing games not for speculative reasons, then you can then sort of start to build up and maybe go through another cycle of speculation and stuff. But I think of the games that I play, like Nine Chronicles is particularly sort of one, and that is, I mean, it's not like a massive growth success story, but there's 70,000 daily active unique wallets. It's not as those games go, those sort of idle RPG games go. Doesn't particularly stand out outside of the blockchain stuff. In terms of the blockchain stuff, you literally don't make any money from it. Really, if you're going to play it properly, you have to buy a battle pass, or obviously you can buy the token on the open sort of markets, and but you don't even to sort of progress in that game in terms of stature in that game, you have to be investing either crypto or real money sort of regularly. Maybe that game will become a great success in 5 years' time, or maybe a game that's using that token. They've announced there's going to be some various other games they're going to try using that token. Maybe one of those will be a success, but you're really at this stage not playing that game in order to make money. You're playing that game because in some way you enjoy it. Maybe not, it's not like a Twitch game that you enjoy. I enjoyed winning that, battle in Fortnite or something. It's not that sort of necessarily enjoyment, but there is a compulsion that you're playing those games, and there are, I'd say probably 10 or so. Maybe there's a few smaller ones I don't know about, but there are people who are playing those sort of games. And really, I think people are getting to the stage now of realizing if you have a successful blockchain game, then there have to be some people putting real, fiat money into that game as well. It can't just survive on the small number of crypto people doing their weird crypto stuff in the hope of making Lamboing or whatever. You have to have that sort of core audience who are just spending $100 a month, or in some cases more, for enjoyment of the game or status in the game or whatever particular sort of metric they're on.
Well, that kind of brings us nicely onto the graph that you did earlier this week about kind of the player retention and daily active players versus in the sort of top Web3 games that are doing the best in terms of DAOs compared to those more speculative sort of games. Because I mean, it's been a struggle. There's been a lot of headwinds for the industry at the moment, but that was a positive graph in the sense that it showed that some of those top games are still growing in terms of daily active users, daily active user wallets, I should say. So, explain that graph a little bit, what it meant, and what you think is sort of what the industry can learn from.
So there is, as I say, I mean, there are some games that are sort of quite unfashionable, and I sort of put it out on Twitter, and there was a few people sort of saying, that those are games that still got loads of bots or whatever. But it's games like Alien World's been out for 4 years now, and again, it's not, people, I think you argue what's the game of it? There's not really a lot of game. It's sort of almost like a clicker game, a sort of slow clicker game. But in that game there are these ideas of planetary DAOs who have a certain amount of value within the game's token, and they can use that in certain ways. And I wouldn't necessarily say that's the first blockchain game someone should go to, because I've been off and on with it for years, and I've never really it's never really compelled me. But there is something there that game is still 100,000 daily active unique wallets. Obviously a bunch of them are going to be bots. But I think they have found their core audience of people who just like being in that world. And, the game is sort of really, you have to buy NFTs, you have to buy sort of mining NFTs, and then you can mine more of their tokens, and then you probably use that either in the DAO or to buy more NFTs. So again, it is one of those games where people did try and speculate at the beginning, but really now, if you want to play that game at a high level, you're buying NFT, higher level, crafting high level NFTs. To get more status in there, and and it's sort of a game that couldn't exist if you didn't use blockchain. So I guess those are the interesting things, and I guess on a very high philosophical level, there's always been this idea of, imagine Call of Duty, but with blockchain, and everything's an NFT, and you make and it's sort of and clearly at that scale of game you can't do it because no blockchain can handle it, and actually it's a bit like it's the wrong way of thinking about it. I think over time, maybe you'll get some shooter games with some NFT things in it, but and probably end up a bit like Wildcard, where the game itself doesn't have any blockchain, because why would you do that? It's bonkers. But the sort of framework around it in some way, like an esports thing, or like a prediction market, wagering, whatever you want to say, that has the blockchain bit in there. But the really interesting thing I think is games that you couldn't make if you didn't have blockchain, and that could be because of the token. It could just be because of the way communities can come together and sort of have shared values in a way that you can sort of do. I mean, when we come on, obviously, sort of EVE Online is a sort of prime example of people who have basically built these companies, and that's not a blockchain game. It has blockchain type elements to it, but those are people who are spending money every month on a subscription model and more. Who are building these big sort of companies. So you can do it without blockchain, but there's not that many games that have worked at that sort of level. And interestingly, the next game in the sort of that EVE universe is using blockchain, because they sort of came to the conclusion that there was so many, when you sort of want that sort of level of game, the sort of openness you need, you sort of end up, even if you're not using a commercial public blockchain, you end up basically building your own blockchain. So why not use a commercial blockchain? So I think those are sort of games that I think are actually sort of quite interesting, and but obviously the problem is those are the sort of games that people who aren't interested in blockchain at a fundamental level, a bit like me, or blockchain gaming, normal gamers are going to go in and go, Alien Worlds, that's the worst game in the world, or we sort of see that a little bit. Is if you don't think blockchain is interesting from an intellectual or curiosity point of view, then you find most blockchain games, well, you just go, well, that's not as good as the Web 2 game, but that's sort of the point. So that's still sort of one of the things that sort of, like, from a design point of view, was I think the sector's still struggling with, that it's spent all its time trying to make a really good Web 2 game and then add Web 3 stuff in there, but it's done it in a sort of really cat-handed way. And in fact, you need to design a different sort of game to use Web 3 properly. And that's sort of the struggle.
Yeah, so let's just move on then and talk about a game developer that has been definitely facing some of that resistance and constantly having calls to drop the blockchain. Who got a really successful working game as it is in EVE Online, and now some industry or some players are very much like now completely against the fact that CCP Games are going Web3 with their EVE Frontier. So you spoke to Hilma this week, and yeah, we've also seen a few new things coming out about their economy and the game. So yeah, just unfold a bit what your discussion was about and what you learned from it and your sort of takeaways from there.
Yeah, I mean, starting off a little bit when we talk about sort of game economies. So the interesting thing about EVE Frontier is it's basically it's doing this sort of wiping the economy. So basically, at the moment, obviously, as it goes further on in development, it will do less of this. But at the moment, it's very early stages. So every so often, it's literally wiping the entire. I mean, it's not really a game; it's the environment, whatever. So the first sort of wipe they're doing, reset, is everything. So everything that's been built in that system is basically being thrown away. So it's almost like the blockchain's being forked, and you start off, again, and everyone has to do it all over again. And that's clearly one way of doing it, because what they're really doing it like a from the ground up blockchain building sandbox. And clearly that's going to go in so many different sort of weird ways. And they do have an EVE token, but obviously at the moment you can't have an EVE token live on a blockchain because that's going to get speculated to oblivion. So they have to, in some ways of forcing people to not be speculative is saying you can play in this world, but every so often everything you do in this world is going to be taken away from you and we're going to start again. So that's
funny, because that's one of the criticisms that Web2 games often get, that they have this sort of central authority to just wipe everything. But the difference is here that they're very transparent about that. It's like no, from the beginning that you're getting into this game on these conditions, you know what you're getting yourself into, sort of thing.
Yeah. And what was interesting talking to Hilmar was, I mean, one thing he said, the EVE Online players, there's a game that's been out there for 20 years and is the most, sort of always sort of had a reputation of being the most hardcore game out there, and I never played it because it's so hardcore I can't even bother to play it. It's a high-end PC game, space sort of combat mining game. And it's done the whole thing. Obviously, people have been sort of married in there, and there's sort of someone's creating a religion in there, and it's it's really the people who play that. They sort of live that game in a way other games you just don't. I won't go into all the detail of all that sort of stuff. But he says that one of the things you have with those EVE Online players is anything that CCP Games, that's the developer, anything they do that isn't EVE Online, they get destroyed for, because all the EVE Online players want is everything for CCP does to be focused on EVE Online. So sort of infamously over the years, CCP has tried lots of different games, sort of types of games within the EVE Online universe. So they've done like shooters. I think have a mobile game still out, EVE Echoes, I think. They've tried various different things because they have a really strong sort of IP there. And they know the EVE Online game is super hardcore. I don't know what the figures are for people playing it, but it's had millions of people have created an account, and I think only probably hundreds of thousands are playing it now. I mean, it just has, it just is really, really hard. And it's a subscription game, so you're paying every month for your account as well. So he said one of the things that as soon as we say we're doing another EVE game, then the EVE people just go, don't make another EVE game, spend all your time making EVE Online again. And actually at the moment, as well as EVE Frontier, which is the blockchain one, they're doing this one called EVE Vanguard, which is again another shooter game based in the EVE universe. So they are actually doing 3 games at the moment. But he said that's the reason they raised $40 million external capital to focus on EVE Frontier. So the EVE Online people don't think their money is being taken to make this other blockchain game. It's sort of the money is ring fenced for these different things. So he says they're just a very conservative player base in general, and I've had a bit of that on the timeline. So we've obviously tweeted stuff out, and Hilmar's tweeted stuff out, and I've had a few people saying from EVE Online universe, obviously, sort of actually not always talking about blockchain, but sometimes just talking about EVE. CCP doing these other EVE games that are rubbish, and they think blah blah blah. So, it's an interesting sort of fan base, and Hilmar's lived that for like 25 years. He's been the face of of all that, and they've gone through EVE Online almost died many times. So it's sort of he's sort of rather world weary about all that. But he used this analogy, and he's a very thoughtful guy, and he thinks a lot about history. And if you've ever heard any of his talks, he thinks a lot about human history. And he says, I like to think about EVE as a city. So he says countries are quite a modern invention, really. There's very few countries. I mean, Great Britain, because it's an island to a degree, has a long history of being a country. But most countries are actually only a few hundred years old. He says city-states, obviously much older. Things like Babylon or or these sort of ancient places. So he sees the games as being cities. So he said, if EVE Online is Rome, we're now building New York for EVE Frontier. And he said, just because we're building a new city doesn't mean the old city goes away. It actually means that the old city gets a bit better because we're building a new city and we understand how to build cities better. So you don't want to take that analogy too far, I guess, but that's the way he thinks about it anyway. But what's even more interesting really with EVE Frontier is that one of the struggles they've had with EVE Online is a lot of the software around it has been built by third-party developers. So obviously EVE sort of builds the game in that sense, or the universe, and then these other people have built all this other software. There's like HR software for onboarding people to a company within EVE Online that's been built. I mean, there's and he said one of the struggles is it's really hard for CCP to open up its sort of a tech stack enough to let these third-party developers build what they want to do without sort of the whole thing becoming unstable. So one of the interesting things they're doing for this EVE Frontier, which they didn't have to do, but they think it's good in general for EVE, is they're open sourcing all their game tools that they use to build EVE. So they have this thing, it's called Carbon, that's just the name for it, but they're looking to open source that. And he says, it's a really big hassle because we're opening sourcing not only the sort of the game engine and all that sort of stuff, but we're doing the sort of the editors and all the other sort of tech stack around the actual game, that the tools that help you make a game. So that can just take a lot of time to do that, and it's not a very exciting task because you're not getting a game out of it, you're just getting better tools. But it costs loads of money. But I think that's why he raised that big sum of money. It's not just for building the game, it's for doing all this other sort of ancillary game dev stuff, which he says will make EVE Online better and make it easier for the community to plug back into that. But obviously for EVE Frontier, that's from the ground up. All this stuff's going to be open source. Obviously, the blockchain stuff is all open source anyway, because all blockchain is open source. That's the point of blockchain, and anyone has the same access. And he says this is the point for EVE Frontier, CCP devs, and me or you, if we could code, or maybe with our new clever AI vibe coding tools, we could be doing the same. We could be building stuff in EVE Frontier as at the same protocol level with the same privileges as the EVE people do. Now, obviously, we're not good at coding, so our stuff would be rubbish. But even if we could do it, but that's sort of the future. And he wants, he's saying what we're doing actually with EVE Frontier is we are building city building tools. We are creating the game building tools that other people will use. We are not building the game. We are building the tool, in a sense. I guess you don't want to go too far. We are leveling the land and giving you the tractors and the digging machines and the road building machines, and say here they all are. Go and build the city. So it's clearly a very long term plan here. This is going to be potentially a game that's never finished because maybe it becomes like a sandbox. Maybe it's like what they're building actually is like Roblox building a network.
I was going to say it's like a UGC platform, which is a very ambitious and fully on one.
It's a UGC platform that is in a very specific setting, which is in space. So it's not to say you couldn't make a match 3 game in there. I imagine you probably could, but it would be a bit odd.
Now we're talking, John.
Now you're talking. Now I'm talking your language. But that's sort of the point of it. And I think again that's Hilmar, who's a very one of the most thoughtful people in game development. Really hard to underestimate how sort of clever he is in thinking about these sort of things. And he's saying, basically, we couldn't really do this without blockchain. We've been trying to do it for 20 years without blockchain, and now we're doing it. And again, it's using blockchain for what it's good at. He says, blockchain's really good for persisting things, and we want to make a world that's persistent. So we're using blockchain, and again, it's going back to, it's not really a game. It's it's a structure which other people can make games. So again, they're using blockchain. They're making a blockchain game in inverted commas, but they're making a game that even the EVE Online people might go, that's not a game. That's just a mess where people can go and make silly things. It's not it's not got any structure or narrative or blah blah blah. So again, and then this is, I guess, the thing that really sort of, some of us, I guess, in the space, more than making money, is the thing that's really interesting is what new type of entertainment can we make that with this new technology. Blockchain, it's a word that everyone uses, and crypto and blah, but all it is a bunch of computers that talk to each other. It's not. I mean, it's clever, but it's not. Once it's been invented, it's not super clever, but it's what you can create with these things for the first time that you never could have done before, which is interesting. And it's just taking like 10 years longer to actually work that out than we sort of hoped. So
yeah. No, but a few years ago we were discussing like when is the term blockchain game sort of gonna drop sort of more permanently. Yeah. We might see that shift now. We're talking about games and developers using blockchain, but it's not per se blockchain.
Yeah. Well, like Wildcard.
Yeah,
Wildcard isn't a blockchain game.
So. Yeah, that's right. Right then, let's round up this fairly long. Right, we have a new startup which I had never heard of before. M10 announcing they'd raised 3 million for. It's yet unannounced, their title, but it's a shooter and it's going to come to the Sui blockchain. So Sui was one of the sort of main investors and a couple of other investors in the seed round. But you know a little bit more about M10. You'd spoken to them, hadn't you?
Yeah, I mean, they're a fairly young team. The only thing I would highlight here really is it's Sui. So Sui, is sort of a long time ago came out of Facebook / Meta, Facebook at the time, I think. But that's where they've sort of come from in blockchain. They've done sort of quite well as an L1. There doesn't seem to be much happening on it at the moment, but games is their big thing. So that's really for the last year. Games has been their big focus, and they've got a society as their sort of their biggest sort of game. But they've got a few, they've got 10, 12 sort of games announced. None of them sort of blow your socks off. I say society is probably the most interesting. Well, is the most interesting one. A pop shooter out of South Korea. I know those guys fairly well. So that's an interesting project.
Gaming console, Sui Play.
Yes, and the big thing they've got this year is they got this Sui Play OX1, which is their it's like a game. A Steam Deck, so it's basically like a little PC, a little handheld PC, and they're pre-ordering it still. I can't remember what it was, $700, $600. I can't remember anyway. But that's sort of, I don't know how many they're going to sell. I think it's sold a couple of thousand. Probably it's not going to be massive, but that's a sort of a spear point. What would you call it? Yeah, they call it the spear point for what they're trying to do with gaming. So it's interesting that they seem to be one that is still, I don't think this investment in this company would have happened without Sui backing it. So I think it's in these times where people are finding it hard to raise money, it is interesting that at least Sui seems to be someone who is, whether they're writing checks or just giving people Sui tokens. I don't know the details of that deal, but they still are, they're still one to watch. And I guess we'll see more. I don't actually know when I have pre-ordered one of these Sui Play things, but I haven't had a lot of communication about when it's actually coming out, which may not be a good sign. But
Good. And next week's news will probably include some of the sort of early reception of Raven Quest, which launches globally on mobile today. It's one of Immutable's sort of big anticipated games going live, so we'll see how that goes. Stay tuned. On that note, we're going to finish off. But thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.